Second language acquisition. This is part 8 in a series of many videos on second language acquisition. And this time we're going to be talking about psycholinguistic approaches to second language acquisition theory and research. Sources for my overview, I'm using the Alice text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition. I'm also using the Seville Troit text, Introducing Second Language Acquisition. Let's talk about psycholinguistic theories of SLA. Well, first, remember in lesson 6, we learned about the input-based SLA theories of Stephen Krashen. During that lesson, we learned that researchers gradually became more dissatisfied with his theories and started adopting theories that conflicted with Krashen. Among those theories was Schmidt's noticing hypothesis and Swain's expanded output hypothesis. Particularly, there was more emphasis on attention, on noticing, on effort, on explicit knowledge, on learning about language. So these theories, with their focus on attention, effort, noticing, practice, can be referred to as psycholinguistic theories of SLA because they draw on theories of learning taken from educational psychology, psycholinguistics. Some examples of psycholinguistic theories, let's see. But basically, there are two major theoretical frameworks in psycholinguistic SLA, but both of them have one major thing in common, which I guess is common for pretty much all psycholinguistic SLA, the idea that learning is learning, that there are certain universal processes for learning that, yeah, sure, language learning is special, but language learning is still just a different kind of learning. And learning a language is just like learning anything else, like learning how to ride a bike or learning how to do algebra, but maybe with the exception that they understand that language involves the application of some extremely cognitively complex skills, sometimes many different skills in unison. So psycholinguistic SLA can be divided into two camps, the camp of symbolism and the camp of connectionism. They are different mainly in terms of how they view language itself and the way language interacts with human cognition. So, with symbolism, they believe humans interpret the world around them as symbols. They store these symbols in their memory and then use those symbols in their output to communicate their ideas to other humans. Connectionism, on the other hand, doesn't believe that we're learning symbols. Instead, they believe that we're making associations between things that happen to be connected somehow. And the more we're exposed to these associations, the stronger those connections are made in our brain. We strengthen those connections through practice and they become faster, more fluent. Connectionism. Symbolism is largely based on linguistics, especially linguistics like universal grammar and Chomsky's ideas, right? Connectionism is actually inspired largely by computer science, artificial intelligence, experiments with computers, efforts to try to teach artificially intelligent computers to learn languages, and studies on the brain using CT scans and other brain imaging devices. Let's talk about symbolism. First, this is going to take most of our time in this presentation. Symbolism can also be referred to as information processing models. I'd say the big name for information processing models in SLA is Barry McLaughlin. Um, these information processing models, they all have one common theme. That is the idea that language learning is all about using limited processing power. Humans' ability to process information is limited, like learning how to juggle. Um, when you're new to juggling, you're going to be dropping a lot of balls. You might want to just start off with one. Eventually, when you get good with one, maybe you can try two. When you get good with two, you can try three. But each time you try to add in a new ball, you're going to be making more mistakes. You're going to be dropping things because you have limited ability with juggling. Similar, our human mind has a limited ability to process information, and that includes second language acquisition. Examples of limited of information processing models would be the multidimensional model, the processability theory from Pieneman, the competition model, skill learning theory. There are many different information processing models in SLA. All of these information processing models have certain ideas, themes, premises in common. One, as I already said, is that second language learning is just like the learning of any other skill, albeit a cognitively complex skill or a series of cognitively complex skills interacting with each other in cognitively complex ways. Complex skills like languages are comprised of many different high order skills that are comprised of many other low order skills. And one skill is often a prerequisite for another. So, for example, you can't learn how to form a question such as how do or when do or why do until you first learn how to form a question with do, because one is a piece of the other. Information processing models generally believe that learners make these mental representations that help them to use the skill at first. A good example of a mental representation would be the grammar rules that we study when we're first learning how to use a grammar, or the translations that you might memorize when you're first learning vocabulary. Initially, when you first start learning a skill, first start using it, it requires a lot of attention and effort. They call this controlled processing. The human brain, as we said before, has limited processing capacity, so learners must choose what skills they're going to focus on and what they're going to neglect. And they do that strategically. With practice, information processing theory says with practice, a skill can gradually be automatized. When it's automatized, it's automatic and it takes less attention. So just like the juggler gets good with 3 balls, eventually he doesn't have to think about it and he can take up the 4th one. Or maybe how you might be with driving. Eventually you're just driving and you're not even thinking about what you're doing. That's the way it is with language learning, and that's information processing theory in a nutshell right there. These mental representations, like these rules that we learn, this explicit or declarative knowledge, once you've acquired the skill and it becomes implicit or procedural knowledge, you can restructure your mental representation or perhaps even lose it altogether. So, for example, tying a necktie is a good example. When you first learn how to tie a necktie, you really have to think about it. Eventually, it becomes automatic. And honestly, if a grown man like me had to teach another person how to tie a tie, he would have to remember how to tie a tie first before he could teach it to others, because he's probably lost his mental representation of how ties are tied. All right. So yeah, a key important idea here is once you've automatized a skill, you've freed up processing power, and you can use that to focus on other skills. And that explains all of these developmental sequences and things. You don't need any theory about a language acquisition device or any of those magical theories to explain the natural order. It's just there are certain prerequisite skills that facilitate the learning of other skills. All right, so very important to information processing models is these ideas of explicit versus implicit knowledge. Similar would be the idea of declarative knowledge versus procedural knowledge. Very similar concepts. Different theorists use different words, but explicit versus implicit, those are important ideas. Explicit knowledge would be mental representations that you're using to support your initial use of a skill, like learning the rules of a grammar that allow you to try to struggle to use the grammar, not very fluently, but they help you. It's kind of like scaffolding yourself, right? If you think about it. Once the knowledge is automatized, you can refer to it as procedural or implicit. And you might eventually get to the point where you don't even know the rule. You're able to follow the rule, but you're no longer thinking about it. You might have actually even forgotten the rule that you originally learned in order to acquire the skill. If you've ever learned how to drive a stick, that's a good example. When you first learn how to drive a stick, you're like thinking, okay, clutch, shift, and you're literally talking to yourself trying to do this. Once you get it down, you completely forget the rule. Your body's just doing it automatically. That's the difference between explicit versus implicit knowledge. An important part of this information processing model in SLA that we discussed already last week was Richard Smith's noticing and attention theories, the noticing hypothesis. That's the idea that noticing something is important for learning and that you have to pay attention to it and make some effort in order to learn it. People who believe these ideas believe that there are certain reasons why a learner chooses to pay attention to a certain form and not pay attention to another form. Those reasons would be maybe that form is more frequent, more common. Maybe it's more salient. It's just more noticeable. Maybe it's more meaningful. Maybe it just has to do with developmental readiness. You're ready to learn that form. Or finally, there's some sort of task you have to complete, and then you have to use that form in order to complete that task. So whether you like it or not, you're going to focus on it. The idea is that learners' attention takes place in what they call the working memory. And even when you're all alone, when you're studying, when you're just trying to memorize something, you could actively use your working memory, running the idea over in your head, playing out the scenario, repeating it silently in your head. That's called rehearsal. You're holding the form in your working memory longer in order to help you acquire it. Also important would be Skehan's idea of rule-based systems versus exemplar-based systems. Skehan believed that second language acquisition usually begins with exemplar learning. So the learner starts off learning memorized chunks, phrases, expressions like, hello, how are you? Fine, thank you, and you. And then they don't really learn that grammar. So when you learn how are you, you're not really learning how to form how questions. You're not learning how to conjugate the be verb, to make it are and is. You're not learning pronouns like you and I and we. You're just learning this unanalyzed chunk, a memorized phrase. But eventually, as learners learn these rules, they start using these rules, applying these rules to create new sentences instead of the ones that they've memorized. Now, when that happens, you start seeing them make errors that they weren't making before. Like maybe, for example, they might have memorized 8. Like, I ate already. Maybe they memorized that chunk before and they were just using that. But now that they're learning the past tense, they might make a mistake because they're learning the grammar. They would be like eated instead of ate. And eventually, once they're finished learning those rules, they go back to the correct way. That's what you would call a U-shaped learning or a U-shaped pattern of development. These people believe that that's evidence for the exemplar rule-based stages of learning. Very important is Peinemann's processability theory. Simply, in a nutshell, this idea is that we get these natural orders of learning, like what Brown, DeLay, and Bird and Krashen were talking about, not because of some language acquisition device or some magical forces that are structuring our learning, not some innate syllabus, but just simply for logical reasons, like some forms are prerequisites to learning other forms, like as I discussed. You can't learn how to form questions such as how do, what do, why do, unless you first learn how to form do questions, because this is a piece of this. You can't learn this without having this. Also, some forms are just more meaningful, more useful, more salient. I can't help but to say this. I always use this as an example. Third person singular grammar. Why does it take people so long to learn such a simple grammar form? Because it's meaningless. Because if you make a mistake with third person singular grammar, it doesn't change the meaning of your sentence. It doesn't cause problems with communication. So if you're trying to figure out, if you're juggling those balls and you're trying to figure out which ball you're going to intentionally drop so you don't drop all of them, you're going to drop the useless one, and that's the third person singular. This is a nice theory. It's transfer appropriate processing theory, TAP. This comes from De Keyser. I think this is something that teachers really need to keep in mind. The idea is that a skill learned in one set of conditions does not automatically transfer to a new set of conditions. Transfer takes some effort, it takes some practice, but transfer is easier when the learning condition and the using condition are similar. So, for example, people learn how to use a grammar form on a worksheet. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to use it when speaking and writing. You have to have some activity, you have to have some practice, you have to have some effort to apply what you learned to do on the worksheet. And with that drill, you have to learn how to apply it in your writing. You have to learn how to apply it in your speaking. And just because you learn how to do it in your classroom structured speaking environment doesn't mean that you're going to be able to use it correctly when speaking outside the classroom. So we talked about we took a long time talking about all these different information processing theories. Connectionism, this is going to be shorter. So information processing theories, connectionism. Information processing theories are symbolism. Connectionism is this idea of that we're learning just simply to make associations. We're not learning rules. It's not about all these different things like the meaning and all information processing. It's just we're learning to make connections. I'll say something a little radical here. Connectionism reminds me a lot of behaviorism. I feel like we've gone full circle here. Remember how behaviorists would say that when you're learning a language, you're learning habits, and the habits of the first language are interfering in the second language. Connectionism, you're not learning habits, but you're learning associations. And the more exposure to those associations you have, the more automatic and fluent those associations get. So they take less and less effort. That sounds a bit like habit formation to me. So, but connectionism, this is an important theory because this theory is growing fast, and the reason why is because it's supported by brain research, particularly research with CT scans, and also artificial intelligence, experiments that successfully teach human language to artificially intelligent machines. the programming really, what's going on really represents connectionism a lot more than all of these other theories. So, connectionism. With information processing models, I used this analogy of the juggler. Um, one ball, two balls, three balls, four balls, five balls, slowly building up the skill, right? Skill learning. Connectionism, let's use the analogy of pulling your brother in a sled across a field of fresh snow. So let's say if um, somebody puts a flag out in the middle of a field after fresh snowfall and says, you got to pull your little brother behind you in this sled, pull him to this flag and back as quickly as you can. Ready, set, go. And you're pulling your little brother through the snow, but the snow is so deep and so fluffy and so fresh. And you're pulling your brother behind you and you're getting exhausted and sweaty. It's tough because the snow's deep and it's soft and it's hard. You're plowing through this deep snow and the sled with your brother's sinking into it. You get to that flag, you touch that flag, and now you're heading back. Wait a second. The way back seems a little bit easier. Why is the way back a little bit easier? Well, because the first way, when you went to the flag, you kind of patted down some of the snow, the way the sled packed down some of the snow. It's like a bit like he blazed a trail through that snow. It's a little bit smoother now. So the way back is easier. And you're like, okay, I did it. How long did that take? And you're like 5 minutes. Oh, really? Ready? Go again. Go again. What do you mean? You go again. Now this is the third time you've gone. And it's easier because it's packed down. It's becoming icy, it's becoming smooth, and you're pulling that sled, and that sled's just gliding. The fourth or fifth time, all you got to do is just push that sled. You maybe just run behind the sled, giving it little pushes, and it just moves right along. That's connectionism. There are these associations. The brain has a path between two neurons. When it's trying to do this activity, it has to connect neuron A to neuron B. The first time it does that, it takes a lot of effort. The second time it does it, it takes less effort. The third time it does it, it takes even less effort until eventually it becomes like a smooth superhighway. Where it's really actually becomes difficult to take any other way because that way is just so automatic now. So as we're exposed through input and interaction to the language around us, we see these associations in the language around us, not necessarily the rules, but we see the associations in the rules that this is associated with that. Like dog is associated with leash, walk is associated with dog, dog walk is associated with park. So we can make these associations, all these different connections between these different neurons. And it looks like a system, but it's not a system. It doesn't actually follow rules. It's a network. Maybe language follows rules, but the language inside the mind doesn't actually have rules. It just is a network that mirrors the associations it picked up from outside. Important idea, once again, this smacks of behaviorism a lot. First language learning versus second language learning. When you're learning a second language, your first language networks sometimes help you with the second language, but sometimes they block or overshadow the L2 network, causing interference. All right. So let's talk about the actual research. What does the actual research tell us? We want second language acquisition theories that are supported by research, but oftentimes the truth is we're just guessing, we're just speculating because we can't really open up a person's mind or brain, peer inside, and really see what's going on. But we do have some interesting experiments, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those. One is from Reber, Walkenfield, and Hernstadt. They did an experiment of the difference between implicit learning and explicit learning. They took a large group of people, divided them into two subgroups, usual experiment, two different groups, right? One group was going to be taught the grammar rules of an imaginary language. Another group was going to be exposed to large quantities of that imaginary language, particularly sentences that exemplified the rules that they were supposed to learn. So, in other words, this group was explicitly taught grammar of the imaginary language. This group was exposed to a flood of the imaginary language in a targeted input immersion experience. An imaginary language. Both groups learned. The group that learned the rules explicitly was more successful, generally more successful at learning the simple rules, but the group that learned the rules implicitly was generally more successful in learning the cognitively complex rules. So, in other words, implicit learning is better for cognitively complex rules. Explicit learning is better for simpler rules. But one really interesting finding was that the implicit learning had more equal results between the learners. All of the learners pretty much learned the same thing through their exposure, regardless of their language aptitude, intelligence, or whatever. But with the explicit learning, there were huge differences with learners. Some learners did really well with explicit learning, and some learners did terribly with explicit learning. So this one very simple experiment teaches us a lot, and I hope you're able to apply that. I hope you're able to apply a lot of what we did in today's presentation. I hope this presentation was a simpler version than what you would get if you tried to read the Ellis text. I hope this helps. All right, and thank you. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.